Turn with me, if you will, to Genesis 41. Genesis 41, verse number 45. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zapnath-Paneai. Now, this was not a name that was common to the people of Egypt. During the 10th, 11th, and 12th dynasties, the pharaohs gave a special name, a particular name, to people that they admired and people that they wanted to give special recognition to. And so Pharaoh is the only one who was permitted to pronounce this person's name by the name that he gave him in particular. So this was his special name for this special person. And so the common person, even the history books, were not allowed to call the privileged person by this name. And so the name that is leveled here says Joseph's name. This was the special name that Pharaoh gave him. And the name itself meant abundance of life. Okay? And so let's continue to read. And he gave his wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, who was he was the high priest of Horus in On, and that meant the daughter of the sun. Okay, but no one could pronounce that name except Pharaoh himself. That was it. Now, Joseph's name that was common to the people of Egypt, and as recorded in the history books, is Menenhapet. And if you look at Egyptian history, then you can see Menenhapet as a person who was. There's actually three Menenhapets, and Joseph is the first one. The others were pharaohs. Now, Joseph is the only person in all of Egyptian history who were given the privilege of having their names registered in statues and permanent records and so forth in the cartouche of a pharaoh. Now, a cartouche is, you can go to Egypt today and buy your name in a cartouche if you want to. But the cartouches of ancient Egypt that identified the name, but the cartouches were only allowed for pharaohs, queens, or the consorts of the pharaoh, priests, or military leaders. But there was a cartouche that was specifically for Pharaoh. Okay. And the Pharaoh cartouche was straight across on the bottom, rather than the typical cartouche that was like that. The Pharaoh's cartouche was straight across and then was down like this. And so only Pharaoh could be identified in history, in the official records of Egypt, and the Pharaoh cartouche is the only one. Pharaoh is the only one who was able to have that, except in the case of Joseph, Menenhapet. He was the only man in all of history of Egypt who is allowed to have a Pharaoh's cartouche, but yet not being Pharaoh. And Joseph's name was quite unique. And the first symbol was like this. And that symbol looks like a man with a big nose, doesn't it? But that symbol meant Judge Supreme. and that any judgment that was offered by Menahop or by Joseph could not be questioned by anyone except Pharaoh himself. So when he made a decree, when Joseph made a judgment, that it was non-challengeable. And this is what this stands for. And then you had this indicates the Nile River and the mountains of Egypt, which means that the possessor of this cartouche, all of his power of judgment extended from one end of Egypt to the next, from the mountains to the Nile River and everything in between. Okay, this indicates food, and that which means that the holder of this cartouche, Menahop, he was in charge, and he was the absolute, total, final say on anything that had to do with food, with the harvesting, with planting, sowing, food distribution, and anything that had to do with food, that he was in charge of it. And there was only two cartouches who had this particular emblem. And even if you look at the history of Joseph or Menahop, and it's actually on not only in Karnak, on the temples of Karnak, but there's also a number of caves with cliff drawings that were placed into the cliffs itself and its inscriptions. And that's about 200 miles south of Cairo, overlooking on the west side of the Nile River. You can, if you take a Nile River cruise down there, then the person who is directing the cruise, he'll say, if you'll look to your right, then you can see the various carvings. This is Menahop. But they don't explain who Menahop was. And usually you can get the true answer for it if you ask them. So, well, who is this guy? Who are you talking about? Then they'll say, this is the life accomplishments of Joseph, which is in the Christian Bible. And so this shows that he was in charge of all food. Now, the center is, I don't know how to draw this. It's a bird. Okay? And that represents Horus. And Horus was the protector of the pharaohs. And Joseph is the only non-pharaoh who had this symbol on his cartouche, that he was in the position of being protected by Horus himself, which is the only man to do that other than pharaohs. And so it's anything you had to do with Joseph seems to be special. Okay, these two symbols themselves indicates son of the supreme God creation. In other words, the son of the God who created all things. And that's what he was identified as. And then this one, this area, indicates whose influence will last for all time, forever. His accomplishments have never been matched. They never will be matched for all time. And so this is the language of Menahop. You can go to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, the Egyptian, the Great Museum downtown. There's a new one that's being built out by the pyramids. And you can see many different displays about what Menahop has done and what he did during his lifetime. And it has a special significance because he is acting as and being given the privilege as a Pharaoh, but yet he was not. And his accomplishments has never been matched and never will be matched. Okay, now, get this preliminary stuff out of the way. Joseph worked tirelessly in his challenge. Well, let's look at this, the next portion of Scripture in chapter number 41. Verse 46. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh. Now, when he became prime minister, it was on June the 30th of the year 1845 BC. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt, which means exactly that, all. So not only Egypt proper, but all of Egypt's colonies, their frontiers, all of their possessions, which basically meant Egypt controlled and owned all the way from the Arabian Sea, which is present-day Saudi Arabia, all the way west until the border of Libya, or present-day Libya. It also meant from what is now present-day Turkey in the north, all the way down to present-day Kenya in the south. And so Joseph went throughout the entire region, seeing what could or could not be done and should be done during this 7 years of prosperity. Let's continue. Throughout all of the land of Egypt, and in the 7 plenteous years, the earth brought forth by handfuls. I'll explain that to you in a minute. And he gathered up all, not just a portion, all of the food of the 7 years, which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities, and the food of the field, which was round about every city, laid he up the same. And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea, very much, until he left numbering, but it was without number. In other words, you couldn't number everything that he did. Now, let me explain all of that to you in language that we can understand today. The brilliance that Joseph had in distributing his wealth of knowledge and what needed to be done for the salvation of the people of Egypt was absolutely phenomenal. He first divided up Egypt proper into 3 sections, north, south, and then what they call the head of the south, which was present day, which at that time was Nubia and Cush, present day Sudan and Ethiopia and northern portions of Kenya. And so he divided into those areas for the growing and the cultivation of the grain that was necessary. And so it was these administrative districts then were given a sector superintendent or administrator who was in charge of that particular area. And they did their work by what they called a food council. So each area had an administrator and then had this council, and their responsibility was to carry out the wishes of Joseph and anything that he wanted. Excuse me a minute. And they did just exactly that. And they followed the wishes of Joseph to the T. But it's easy for us to read the event 3,000 years later on what was happening at the time. But when we stop and think about exactly what impact that Joseph had and what he did and the things that he accomplished coming out of one man's brain is absolutely phenomenal. We have records of Herodotus, the great Greek historians. We also have the records of Muhammad bin Yusuf El-Wihan, who was the Arabic an Arabic historian who was there, and he was an eyewitness to the events. And I can go on and on and on and give you at least 300 different records, historical records of everything that he did, but they all confirm the same thing. First of all, the first year of the 7 years of good, the grain that was produced was 300% greater than the year before. Okay, 300%. The second year of the harvest of plenty was 400% greater than the first one. And that first one was 300% greater. Okay, the third year was 500% greater than what was gathered on the year previous, on the third year. The fifth year, let me get my records right. Okay, the third year was 500% greater than the second. The fourth year was 600% greater than the third. The fifth was 700% greater than the fourth. The sixth year was 800% greater than the fifth. The seventh year was 900% greater than what the sixth year had been. Herodotus tells us that with each year of the 7 years of good, each year produced 700% more than the year previous. And there was so much grain that was produced that you couldn't keep up with it. And literally, as the Word of God said, like the sand on the seashore. And there was so much that it was beyond your comprehension to count, and beyond your comprehension to see just exactly the abundant harvest that was being produced. And it was something that was mind-blowing, that could not be comprehended. And not only with the grain, but also with other food, which we'll get into in just a minute. The rain capacity, they tell us that at that time the rain was about plus or minus 50 inches a year in all of Egypt, and then the rain actually doubled. And not only that, but the regular flooding of the Nile that happened every year, that also doubled and tripled and quadrupled. So rather than laying down 12 to 18 inches of soil, it laid down 3 and 4 feet of it. The most fertile soil that was in the world at that time. And it made this tremendous harvest that was going on. I know my wife and I were in the Egyptian desert when it rained for the first time in 300 years. And I can imagine what type of a response it had with these folks that was happening at the time. The Quran says that the coming of Messiah will be accompanied, which is, their Messiah, would be accompanied by rain, thunder and rain. Well, it hadn't rained in 300 years when we were down there. And it only rained, Paula, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it only rained about 10 minutes. And it wasn't much, but the people went absolutely berserk. They canceled all the television programs, and they have special reports on the rain. And special reports about whether this was an indication of Messiah is coming. And they were just beside themselves by 10 minutes worth of rain. And now we have this type of rain that was experienced here in Joseph's time. And you can imagine and you can understand why they felt he was on the same plane as maybe a God on the earth, and why they called him the Son of God for these things and many more. Now, the grain that was collected, the first place where they stored it was in the here it is. Can y'all see that? Okay, good. The first storage areas were in the oasis. Now, and these oases still exist today. But in all of these oases is where the first grain harvests were done. And the names of these oases are up here. When you look at your map, you can see that number A, B, C, D, and so forth. And these are the locations of that. And that all of them were located on the west side of the Nile River. And I don't know if I can do it or not, but each one of these oases was connected to the Nile River by a canal. And some of them had even more than one canal. And these canals had a direct access to the Nile River. Now, the combined size of all of these oases was 735 square miles. And every inch was taken up with the storage of grain. And not just corn, but corn and wheat, rye, millet, carob, sunflowers, just anything of grain. And these oases, over 700 square miles was taken up with the storage of this grain. Now, what Joseph knew what he was preparing for was the survival of the people of Egypt. And so with that in mind, he continued on a daily basis doing what was necessary to do that. Now, he also, the Nile River, every now and there's 5 different cataracts. Now, the cataracts are waterfalls. And that as you go down the Nile River, and if you ever go to Egypt and have a Nile River tour, as you go down the Nile, all of a sudden you'll come to a stop, and the tour boat will anchor out in the middle of the Nile, and then the ship will start turning like that, because around these cataracts they built canals that the ship can go around these waterfalls. Well, what the first ones that built around these cataracts was Joseph. He was the very first one to make the canals around the waterfalls, and they're still being used today. The ones that Joseph did, or at least the foundation of them, are still being used as Joseph did it at that time. And the reason for it is to bypass the waterfalls so they can get the harvest of the grain and get the grain distributed. And so that's still being used today. Now, in addition to the storage at the oasis, Joseph built what they called at that time storage elevators. Now, he built about 800 of these. And you can go to Egypt today and you can still see examples of it, especially if you go to the area of Saqqara. There's an excellent elevator that is still there and that you can visit. And all right, this is ground level. These elevators, these storage facilities, were made of brick and limestone. Limestone was underneath, brick was on top of the ground, and the depth one to the next 164 feet. It went down into the ground, and you can still see that at the example in Saqqara, and you can look down and you can still see, and these are steps. The steps started at the ground level, and you could walk down all the way to the bottom. As the grain is taken, then you can go down further and further and further if you want to. Now, the height that it stuck up in the air was 230 feet. And which was quite phenomenal because now you're talking about something that is twice the size of a typical water tank of a municipal water supply. I mean, that's huge. But it was one of the most phenomenal engineering feats in the world at that time. And it all came out of Joseph's head. And the size of this thing, okay, the size of it was approximately 60 feet square. And he built 800 of these. And every bit of it was used for the storing of grain.